Another draft physics video presentation. Okay, anyway, DraftScience here on YouTube. Anyway, comments and then Van Biezen Photon stuff. Call it stuff. What they say. Anyway, DraftScience. Some guy has done a response video to your model with his own counter simulation of interacting particles. It's no video, so he took it down. And regardless, I mean, the arguments are pretty simple. I mean, the magnetism as a filter argument is, in my opinion, indestructible. It explains where the energy comes from, why there's movement without any apparent energy source. Nothing loses mass, nothing gets hot, all of that stuff. It's indestructible. Now, the new theory now about what exactly photons are, explaining why there's change in their trajectory and why you can have this idea of constructive reconstruction of photons and destruction by merely breaking the phase of the photon, and that you can put a photon back together when you've only broken its phase. These are indestructible arguments. The model I've presented of the two forces and the two kinds of matter to explain charge is indestructible as a model. You can just look at it and say, yes, that makes sense. Now, you can't apparently do that, so physics is kind of over your head, I guess. But whatever. I mean, this, whatever this is, you're not, well, whatever. Just go ahead, play your game. You're going to keep trying to find the flaw. Instead of saying something rational, and the rational response would be to say, hey, you've pointed out how they really don't have a lot of evidence for any of these conclusions they've drawn. You're right. It's obvious. The lack of evidence is obvious. You go out and try to find it. You can't even find it. You can't even find somebody doing the Stern-Gerlach experiment. You can't find a scientist doing that. You can't find them doing any kind of worrying about polarizing filters. They'll show you all kinds of stuff. Has anybody ever measured whether they get hot or not? I mean, they're supposed to be killing photons. Shouldn't they be getting hot? Shouldn't there be some physical reaction? Yeah. And then, don't even want to get into the lensing stuff. How many ways you can play with optics, and they haven't tested these experiments at all. I point out LIGO hasn't done a single experiment to demonstrate. They'll say things like, don't drive too close to our tunnels, don't do this, don't do that. Have they provided a single shred of evidence that, pointing out how sensitive their device is by seeing something other than a gravitational wave? No. Zero. To me, that's, if you're going to say, okay, you're a fair cop, well, then go ahead and admit the truth, that conventional physics is based on shreds of evidence. I mean, it is just as bad as religious theory. There's just stories, and they're basically saying to you, well, the only way you can defeat our theory is defeat our stories, and that means you have to insult Moses, or you have to insult Jesus, you have to insult one of our cartoon characters, and basically say, no, that's a lie, that didn't really happen, you're just kind of, delusional if you think, Jesus went by and laid his hands on somebody and they rose from the dead, even though the maggots were eating them, the maggots jumped out and everything was just fine. You want to believe that crap? Well, go ahead and believe it. I can't stop you. But I'm just saying that's what basically physics is based on. You can see that science the physicists don't do anything to stop the nonsense that's out there. The quantum video, Dr. Quantum bullshit video. They don't do anything to stop any of it. They don't protest in any way, because it's all just storytelling. They're just religious kooks. And any aggrandization of their fake little stories probably pleases them. Go ahead, make up some evidence. Anyway, sorry. I just, look, great. Post a link, fine. Yes, the video probably worked when you posted it, fine. But you didn't take it down, right? So apparently you didn't pay too much attention. that the video's not there anymore. And who knows what it actually said, if anything. Alright, so here's Louisiana. I guess is what he's calling himself now. I used to live there. Warm, that's the only nice thing you can say about it. People actually just sucked. It's my memory of them. The animals were okay, but the people sucked. Anyway, so am I correct? Here we go again. In thinking the velocity of the Earth is the force of gravity. The velocity of the Earth is the force of gravity. No, you're not correct. Gravity doesn't make velocity in an orbit. The orbit, the orbital velocity, had to come from the matter that entered the solar system. I mean, whether it entered it or whether it was just remnants of what pre-existed. It had to get into the orbit by having velocity. If it didn't have velocity, it would have fallen into the sun. It would have gained velocity towards the sun instead of constantly having that velocity negated by the velocity out that the Earth has. The Earth has out velocity, and it's the out velocity that keeps it from falling into the sun. I have to make this text bigger. I'm getting, getting blind in my old age. But the spin of the Earth is pushing me outward up. That's not really what spin does if you think about it for a second, right? So, I mean, you're really, I'm sorry, but, people aren't even trying to do any of this on your own, are you? I mean, when you're spinning, say the gravity's pushing you towards the center of the Earth, right? When you're spinning, you can sort of understand that your motion is in not the up direction, that it's in some other direction. And like the Earth, you're sort of going to orbit because you have a force pushing you down and a force that's linear to that or perpendicular to that this way. And so the motion of the Earth, although fast, is not that fast. And it's sort of like making a comparison between the velocity of a bullet and then you blowing, trying to blow the bullet off course. Just isn't really going to happen. That's the short answer. So let's see. Zohar says, no, the velocity of the Earth is affected by gravity. Again, this is, no, it really isn't. It gains no velocity from gravity. Just doesn't. Okay, so it's in a constant state of acceleration. That is a changing vector. And so the velocity heading out of the solar system is using up the gravity component to stay in the solar system. That's the nature of the orbit. But it's not the same thing as gravity. Well, it's all the same thing. So, but whatever. And I'm not sure that the spin of the Earth is causing the force on you. The main force you have to deal with is probably gravity, which is coming from the fact that the Earth is blocking. Okay. A lot of the force bits from pushing you up. The fact is, you fall, you move because of an imbalance in the force. And yes, that's clearly the argument, that the thing that's in the way is the guy on the other side of the Earth who's moving in the opposite direction that I'm moving in. I'm going that way, he's going this way. And that's true of all the matter underneath him, and it's true of all the matter below me. They're all heading that way. And to head some direction, to move, just like the spin has two components. A component that's using energy going this way and showing energy going the other way. There's two kinds of motion. That means there's absorption in both of those directions at any one time. Something has to be absorbing energy to move, and likewise on the other side. And that absorption is essentially your the gravity you fall into. And it's the same thing for the guy below me is moving towards me, all that matter, and all the matter below me is moving towards him. And if it's doing that, it had to absorb stuff that would have hit him, and he's absorbing stuff that would have hit me, and it's not hitting me. And because it's not, I'm going to fall into the change the low pressure created. The pressure above me is going to be greater. The universe is hitting me with more stuff from above than it's hitting me from below because it's a whole bunch of crap under my ass. Yeah. Play-ish on words. Let's see, pushing up, but letting the force bits push you down as much as they want. I don't know, that probably isn't a good way to say anything, but anyway. The Earth blocking the force bits makes me think differently for sure. Well, I've only said it about 6,000 times, so I guess when somebody else says it, you can understand. Okay, well, I'm just going to get rid of this because, frankly, you people got to stay on the subject. That is, you have to understand the subject a little bit. All right. So glad Ken turned me on to your videos. So I don't even know what that could possibly mean. Ken Wheeler does not acknowledge anything except dead people, and I'm obviously not yet dead. So whatever. Don't know what it could mean. So anyway, Tom Spencer. Please use subtitles, auto-translate English. So he can't find a physics argument in English videos. He has to resort to ones in Spanish, right? To make some kind of point. So you can't find a similar point made in some kind of English video. So of all the videos, and this is these are basically Dr. Quantum videos. So yeah, the first one there is no auto-translate for, so you can't auto-translate it. The second one you can, okay, and I watched it and it's garbage. So the guy basically has taken a book from 1956 or something, and then done a crude simplification of the experiment. It's kind of a two-slit experiment using atoms, and it's just as bad as the Dr. Quantum videos. The detectors, all that crap is in them. These fake detector experiments that have never been done. So, and he says thanks after he posts this crap. So this is just the same crap argument that I've explained hundreds of times about the two-slit experiment, and yet they keep throwing it in my face as somehow I haven't accounted for the silly, dopey, idiotic crap in those videos, and it's all crap. So what can I say? You have somebody citing getting 1 million views in Spanish, right? See, another thing physics doesn't fix. For an experiment that hasn't been done, especially as illustrated. It's certainly, you don't put atoms in cardboard boxes and then poke a hole and let the atoms out, and that never happened. And then put detectors on, take detectors off. None of that ever happened. So what do you want me to say? Sorry, no sale. That's what I say. It's just bogus bullshit. You can't make the argument. You can't make the argument. So just tell me I have to account for the detector experiment. Well, give me a link to it actually being done. Please. And then it comes down to this whole single photon argument too, which is a problem. Now, 2 months ago, if somebody said single photons are bullshit, I might have insulted him. Okay, because I didn't think it was unrealistic to think that you could make a single photon by just reducing the electricity you're sending into something, and at some rate you get to some point where you're only sending little tiny bits of photon. But now that I understand what photons are better, how they were really huge, how they have to be created by multiple atoms at the same time, have to be creating the photon. That's why it has such a huge polarization. No, you have to concede making a single photon is not a simple act. And the whole way you figure out that you're reducing the number of photons is by seeing the photons land somewhere, by collecting them with some collector. And all of the collectors are sort of dependent on a certain amount of energy. And so this idea of a single photon is kind of So I'm just saying it's more complicated. I guess I'll draw some of this and get to it. But anyway, so let me come up here a little bit. Alright, Zohar says, good shit. Thanks for responding. I guess I got confused because you've used a checkerboard as an analogy. Yes, only in the crudest sense have I, and only because Feynman actually pointed out how, well, maybe we're all full of shit, he said that, and this is all as simple as a checkerboard, and it's just that the checkerboard is so humongous and dense, that we can't see the forest through the little tiny trees. There's just too many trees. Too many little checkerboards, and that yes, even a simple checkerboard could create a piece of toast, the image of toast, and it could put Mary's, the mother of Jesus on that toast. Even a checkerboard could do that. If you have enough checkers, you could create a pattern that looked like that. So that's the only context I've used it in. So I assume you would only allow movement in 3 directions. Well, I don't know. Frankly, I just don't know how that assumption is possible. The website alone has the image of the little bits going in all directions. So I just, what am I supposed to say? Jesus, it's so dangerous playing with this frickin' page. Oh God, I hate YouTube. You can see the video almost die because of this stupid web page. Let's get back to the message. Thank you. Alright, well, I'll leave that one up there. See more, read more. Come on. Alright. After your latest explanation for photon interference by deconstruction and reconstruction of multiple photons, yes, and how is that beyond credulity? How is that explanation just it can't possibly be? How do you explain single photon and single electron interference? Well, I don't. In terms of I don't think they're single photons. So the simple argument is that if you're going to make an experiment to detect single photons, the classic one, see, then this is another thing they haven't done, right? They don't repeat any of these experiments in a classic sense. So the first experiment was done by a French guy. And the basic idea was, and this is like in the 50s or 40s or something. So you have a light source, you put something in front of the light source that is fairly opaque. And the idea is that there's a tiny enough of little tiny holes in it where every now and then a photon is able to squiggle out. And so every now and then a photon actually hits one of these little magical cracks or holes or thinnesses in the material, and a little bit of a photon will fly out and get somewhere. Now, the only way you know is you're reducing, as you're creating this film, right? You could say, oh, it's too dark because no photons are getting here. Well, the only way you know whether a photon got to the surface was you have to see it. You have to see it hit, or you have to put a photographic film, as he did, and you see if the photographic film gets exposed. And if it's not getting exposed, it means you don't have enough openings in your material, so to speak. So the light can't get through. Now, there's a simple argument made for the slit experiment. Now, say if I just did this experiment. I just have an opaque source and I have a photographic film. Well, then you could argue that the photons that get through this material intact, okay, that is their polarization, their entire polarization gets through, they'll land and you'll get a response of a real photon. Now, it's also theoretically possible that a piece of light gets through from this piece, and this is a broken photon, and another broken photon could go from here, and it would light up here. So there's different ways you could light up the photographic film, both consistent with my theory and consistent with their theory. In some respects, I would suppose. I don't know where these would combine. The only difference would be there wouldn't necessarily be any pattern because the length differences wouldn't matter as much for the phase argument, because you could be in phase from almost any direction with the straight lines. You can't be, if you have a little aperture in the way, then you can't have straight lines that could intersect. So technically you could light up any spot by combining, it wouldn't be a bar pattern. So I meant that to look like any spot, and it really didn't. But you could light up any spot with two broken pieces of a photon, two out of phase bits that combine to make a new photon. Two pieces that were broken getting through the material but are combinable as the right frequency, visible frequency. And again, you have to have enough of these little bits. Ray length matters. All right, which we'll get to with the Van Biezen video. So the change they make, all right, is then when you put a slit in the way, well, now it's a little more complicated, right? So if you put a barrier in the way, now the only photons they can get through are ones you can't go parallel across this way, so you've eliminated that possibility. So you could have a photon that just comes right through the middle, intact, and never gets disturbed, or you have to put the pieces back together again, where the photon went through and it does this, piece of it gets knocked off and it goes to this location, and then another photon goes through, a piece gets knocked off and it goes to this location, and they combine those two. Now that can only happen if more than one photon is coming out at the same time. So clearly it would be a way of measuring this difference. Now I would argue if we had a bunch of detailed experiments, if they had actually done these experiments, that they would find that they can lower the intensity of the photons by making this thicker, and they can go lower and lower and lower, and there will be a point where they'll get on a photon that will go through the slit and light up this surface and only this surface. They'll only get these straight through-ish photons. Now, they might be able to get one that goes this way, of course. So they'd have to make this small. So you'd have to confine the size of the material. So have this as a block and this is a block. So you'd have to put an aperture in front of the aperture, much like the Young experiment. You'd have to confine your light source so it doesn't spread beyond, so it can't do this angular thing very easy. But that is going to mess things up a bit. But the point would be is that even if it did the angular thing, there's a point where you would get either just a little misty pattern here, light in the center, darker on the fringes. And then there'd be a point where you just bring the intensity up a tiny bit more, and then you'll start getting the fringes. Because the fringes are really dependent on you getting more than one photon to that slit. Can't happen otherwise. But I'll just argue they haven't done the experiment, so you're claiming facts that don't exist. You're saying somehow I have to account for facts that don't exist. You're saying I have to explain an experiment that hasn't been done. Okay, so that's pretty obnoxious of you. But clearly I'm saying that the very idea of creating single photons is not simple. It's in itself a complex subject. And you want to pretend, oh no, the science is well established and well detailed. Well, it's not. Go watch the Veritasium video where he's using modern technology to do it. And half of his signal is noise. Half. 1/2 of the signal is noise. It's not that simple, asshole. Alright, so let's see. How do you explain single photon and single electron interference? Well, like I said, go show me the single electron gun or the single photon gun. Anyway. Or are you saying that these single photon electron experiments never happened? So, because I say they haven't happened how you're arguing, they haven't happened in some kind of obvious way. You don't have the photographic film. We don't have the photographic film from the French guy who did this, let alone anybody else's photographic experiments, right? That's the best technology to be using for this, the most reliable technology. So where's your experiment? So why don't you give me a link to this experiment done where you know that it was only one single photon that came through the slit at a time? Because the only way you're going to detect it is with a detector, okay? And those detectors are, they're demanding. They require a photon to be a certain thing, and then they say a photon arrived here. But they don't care if the ray length is too short, not a photon. If the frequency is a little bit off, not a photon. That's the way it works. So you show me your precise experiment that demonstrates the production of a single, absolutely one photon at a time. Show me the device that does that. And then you can be an arrogant fuck. But until then, you can't be an arrogant fuck with your little stories. So again, I'm not saying it never happened. I've just explained it. Yeah, it happened, but it's a very crude experiment. Okay, the French experiment was really crude. And we don't even have any evidence of the results. There's no evidence, okay? Go look online, try to find it. You won't find it. Yeah. So, and you're going to sit there and say, I'm not allowed to point that out without being a science denier. I'm denying evidence by merely pointing out I can't find it. So why don't you show me the evidence, you little fuck? Excuse my French. And physicists are lying. So that's what he perverts it into. So anybody who challenges their little holy theory of crap, all right, is some kind of, like I said, that they're the liars and they're the cheaters and they're the thieves because they're denying our facts. You don't have facts. You don't have experimental results. Again, the Eddington experiment has never been successfully, beyond the margin of error, duplicated. And the one that was done in 2019 was so synthetic, so distant from his experiment, there's no point in even calling it doing the Eddington experiment. And, so, you people, you just won't concede that your evidence sucks. It's weak as hell. You're just so fucking arrogant. And then you accuse other people of being, of lacking credibility and integrity because they deny your fucking God. I mean, you are such religious fanatics. Despicable human beings. How dare you impugn my integrity? Okay, because I merely point out what I found as facts. I plead with you, provide me links to your fucking facts. Provide me links to your experiments actually being conducted. Why don't you show me the video somewhere of somebody actually doing the Stern-Gerlach experiment with something called an electron to measure its spin. Some sort of feature that they claim isn't even really spin. I mean, this is such crap. Okay, your evidence that an electron is really a dipole. It's a secret. It actually wears the proton dress at night. It's actually bi. You people just suck. It's all woo to be safely ignored. Now, where the fuck am I ignoring it, jackass? Show me the video where I ignore the evidence. Your evidence. Show me where I ignore your argument. Show me the video where I'm ignoring it, shithead, liar, piece of fucking crap. God, you're such a piece of scum. Fucking God. If you had kids, you think they'd be proud of you? Douche. You make accusations you back up with nothing? Again, show me this impeccable single photon producing device. Show it to me. Alright, your teachings are prehistoric. No, they're anti-religion, and that's all it is. And in spite of the fact that Newton was a religious kook, he didn't shove it in his science, and that's all you people do. Alright, so yeah, prehistoric is, okay, yeah, I think you ought to maybe obey the standards of Newton. That is, you shouldn't make all these claims when you don't have any fucking evidence. That's the truth. And it's prehistoric how? And that it makes sense that it doesn't have wooey magical things in it like boogeymen and demons and other kind of monsters. So that's prehistoric, is to not have wooey Thor explanations. There's gods in the sky. You have bent space and virtual photons as the two most fundamental elements of your physics. One thing you admit is completely a placeholder for the real thing because we haven't found it, and the other one makes absolutely no sense. You have a bent nothing. The bent nothing tells the somethings what to do with the magical no forces. And you have the arrogance to call somebody else a name when that's all you're doing is believing because they told you so. You're pathetic. And this has to do with the Pharaoh cell of all things. And what have I done? Oh, I took a microscope and put the material under a microscope and saw exactly what the little bits are doing. And because I did that, I'm doing prehistoric science because I actually investigated it. Like none of you will do, and none of your sellers of the woo will do. They won't tell you the truth. Ken Wheeler is just overtly lying. He won't explain to you that yes, each LED is creating one curved line. That's exactly what it's doing. And you put them all together and look, they look all fancy and fun. But it's just a bullshit image. You pathetic assholes just eat that shit up because you want to believe in your religion verse. For whatever it's worth, it's probably absolutely nothing. This is from some asshole who call himself manly advice. Yeah, sure. I don't think Ken Wheeler is wrong about everything. Well, what do you think? What thing do you think he's right about? Air can be smelly. Maybe he said that someday. Sometimes air is smelly. Okay, maybe that's right. But what else has he said that's coherent or could be called right? He didn't. Whatever he's right about, he ain't right about it because he said it explicitly. That's for sure. All right. I don't think it's everything, but that is partly due to the fact that he didn't really come up with anything on his own as far as I can tell. Well, his whole pi times the psi times die thing seems to be his own little whatever it is. Whatever that crap is. But yes, it doesn't have anything to do with reality. The higher the capacitance, the greater the magnitude, or whatever the fucking bullshit is. The smaller the distance, the higher the capacitance. Smaller the space, the higher the capacitance, or whatever the fuck it was. Just retarded. I can't imagine any scientist saying that kind of shit. Alright, anyway, as far as I can tell, except maybe for the things he has neglected to demonstrate. Well, I don't even know. Neglected to demonstrate? He can't demonstrate the stupid claims he's making, like magnets, the inverse square law, the basic laws of the force that have been calculated millions of times by millions of scientists, well, let's say thousands anyway, are somehow wrong. And Ken Wheeler found that out. He found out you can buy a stronger magnet and it obeys different laws. It's weaker than the weak magnet by some magic. You can circumvent Ken Wheeler by reading the other people he talks about, such as Heaviside, Steinmetz, and Dullard. Well, why would I read any one of them? Two of them are archaic, okay? It's before they even knew what an atom really was. And Dullard the name suits him, okay? He thinks the universe is a violin or something. He's just, forget it. Yeah. The ideas aren't bunk. Yeah, they are. But Ken doesn't seem to make a real attempt in explaining any of it. Well, he can't explain it. You can't explain it. So you're saying he's somehow right, but you can't explain it either because it's all wooey nonsense. All this wavy nonsense is just that. Wavy nonsense. You have a silly theory. You're looking at a torpedo and you're saying, look at it wave across the water or through the water. It's just stupid. You see a car going down the road. What, you think it's waving somewhere? Come on. If he understands the things he says he does, he's absolutely terrible at communicating any of it. Well, he's successful in the sense that I guess you can fool all of the people all of the time. Just about. Personally, I'll stick with Dullard and Steinmetz. I don't know why you would stick with Dullard. Again, what is his grand theory? He's just another one of these assholes who thinks Tesla was onto something. Tesla was on to wasting a huge amount of electricity burning holes in the ground. Tesla wasn't on to something. The whole reason why his little thing, he pissed away $2 million on a nonsense idea, and you think it was still a great idea, and the government is conspiracy, and everybody didn't just jump in and give him more money because it was such a great idea. No, it's because it didn't work. I mean, any asshole can waste, any asshole could throw a piece of dynamite in a house and say, look, I demolished it in the most efficient way possible. They're not going to pay you to blow things up. Anyway, personally, I'm whatever, Steinmetz, until Wheeler decides to provide schematic for the electrogravitic device that he's only half described in some other videos. Well, he pretends that he understands UFO technology, see, and the UFOs have to be saucers and they have to do this and that because he's assuming they exist and they're using anti-gravity, which, yes, he says the UFOs don't exist, but then he explains why the UFOs are always saucers. Like that makes any sense. With windows in them. I always use the window argument. People always draw the UFOs with windows, and you're just saying, why would I fly through space with something with windows on it? Why wouldn't I just put a bunch of cameras on the outside of the ship? Why the fuck would I leave a window, for something negative to happen, I mean, clearly it's not likely that the strongest material you could make your ship out of is going to be transparent. That's not likely. Anyway, I think he's on the right track. Well, then you're an idiot. But he's not the guy to follow. Just please don't throw out the baby. What baby is there, asshole? There's no citation to any real thing. You think there's hyperborealoids and tornadoes running around the outside of magnets. I'll just ask you, where do you think the energy comes from for all that movement? Where? Where is it coming from? How is it possible to have all of that crap? I would argue to you the price the Earth pays for having its gravity is the center is molten. That's the truth, okay? Gravity has made the center of the Earth a hot place, and it's made the sun a hot place. There's no hope for you morons. Ugh. I read your shit comment, and it was shit. You didn't make any counter arguments to anything I've said. Okay. Whoa, dude. Hello. You are not a scientist. Doesn't matter. I'm making arguments. Clear arguments. I'm pointing out how there's no evidence of this single photon making device. There's no evidence of a two-slit experiment done with anything called a detector. There's no evidence of it. You can't assert something has happened when there's no evidence that it happened, that anybody did the experiment. There's no even notes of the experiment being done. There's nothing. All right? That I don't need to be a scientist to do. To point out how weak and feeble your evidence is, I don't need to be a scientist to do that. You realize this guy has a PhD in physics, right? So what? What does a PhD in physics mean? Do you understand what a PhD in physics means? It means you have a PhD in mathematics. It doesn't mean you understand anything about what goes up comes down. Doesn't mean you have any skill at engineering yourself out of a paper bag. It just means that you can do certain kinds of formulas, okay, where the premises are preposterous. Like, I can make little bits of a photon infinitely close together. Or I can have a Huygens principle where a photon goes into a slit and it actually turns into an infinite number of little baby waves. And the infinite number of little baby, the infinite number of them in a confined space, the infinite number of them all interfere with each other and cancel out. That's your bullshit, asshole. That's your PhD bullshit science. And I'm not even touch on many universes. They write books. PhD physicists write books about how, oh yeah, they think it's totally plausible that this silly concept that every time a photon bangs into an electron, a new universe is created. I mean, I'm sorry, you're mockably bad PhDs. I mean, the evidence of their existence is abundant. He's done his research. His research in what? Okay, yes, he researches the subjects he talks about and spews the jargon, the garbage, the nonsense. Okay, he's written papers, says you. He's published a book about what? Cooking? Or, how to look like a psycho killer for fun? And you're just going to trash him because you can see his behind-the-scenes process of making a video. No, I'm trashing what he's asserting as some sort of proven fact that, oh, we demonstrated or we proved it somewhere, when that's not what they did. Okay, the experiment is barely even related to the subject for which they're saying it's a proof. Okay, you can't be a skeptic if you have no idea what you're talking about. Well, you haven't demonstrated how I have no idea, so you haven't posted a link to anything. Okay, demonstrating a fact. You haven't posted a link to some experiment that demonstrates I'm wrong. You haven't pointed out how a single thing I've said about how these things work physically can be proven to be wrong. That it can't be that way because a certain experiment demonstrates how it can't be that way. Again, why don't you show me how in the radar experiment, in the radar two-slit experiment, how it's impossible that jamming could be the solution. That all you could do is just take the very fact that we can't tune in on a radio receiver to see two signals at the same time. That the radio receiver can't do that. That the signal can't be out of phase and you can pick up the two signals. No problem. The same frequency out of phase, send in two signals and you have a radio receiver that can decipher that. And it can figure out which one is which. It can separate the two. There's no radio receiver that can do that. So you're just such a fucking piece of shit liar. All right. So that's it for the usual crap. Okay. Unaccountable. No evidence provided demonstrating anything they're asserting. Certainly no evidence that I've cheated an argument or cheated the evidence or in some way evaded a subject. No evidence of any of these accusations being true. They're just a bunch of lies spewed by liars. That's it. To put me on the defensive like somehow I have committed some kind of crime, just make the accusation, you're a thief. And then what, I have to prove I never stole anything? The tactic of the desperate, and that's all it is. You're just like the religious fanatics. Change the subject, and never get to the evidence. Just make assertions. Oh, it's proven that carbon dating doesn't work. Just say things. Don't prove your proof. Don't show us the proof. All right. Maybe I'll take a pause and we'll be back with more poorly evidenced, can't call it theory, dogma from the apostles. Alright, we're back. So, leave us begin. Michael Van Biezen, I lecture online, nice enough guy, blah blah, makes good videos, if it was good physics. I wish it was better physics, that he was making good videos explaining.
In the previous video, we saw that photons, even though they really don't have mass, kind of act like they do have mass. So there's some mass equivalent to a photon. And we look.
So again, the mass equivalency is just, again, they're saying that it's, they're changing essentially, the velocity has to be combined with some idea that there's something, okay, that obviously moves much slower than the speed of light. And so that you have to have this idea that velocity is basically dragging something with you, and that's your mass. You have to drag the mass, and that's what slows you down. So a little thing hits you going the speed of light, and essentially that speed of light has to be spread over your entire mass. And when spread over your entire mass, it reduces to a much slower speed. And that's sort of the way I think a reasonable person has to understand it. He's turning this mass thing into something like somehow the frequency is the momentum, and it's just so wrong-headed, and it makes it has no continuity. And this video I'll just point out all the consistency errors with even their other theories about how the universe works.
Learned that the mass equivalent, and I'll put mass in quotation marks, is equal to h times f over c squared. So that's like the equivalent mass.
Right, so two constants, h and c, okay, two things you can't change, and you just have the f. So f equals m is all that equation is really saying. You just change what you're using as a value. You could use the speed of light as the quantity that you're measuring, and then you could just cut out the the other stuff as constants. They're irrelevant to the real function of the equation. So he's just saying mass is frequency.
Of a photon. And we do believe, and we have evidence, of course, experimental evidence that it is indeed so.
Right, but he won't cite the evidence that it is so. Certainly, he won't explain this how the evidence has these fundamental flaws in the fact that you can scrutinize this evidence and say, well, there are alternative theories for the outcome. So again, it's just this, trust us physics.
That photons are affected by gravity, and as photons move away from an object that has gravity or moves towards an object that has gravity, it will either gain or lose energy because it has to overcome that.
Right, and there's no way it can gain or lose energy without you realizing, well, that means it has to do it velocity. There's nothing else to work with. It doesn't get heavier, it doesn't get lighter. Come on. So all you have to work with is speed, and so now you're basically saying there is no consistency to the speed of light, that it can't be used as a real constant because the speed of light isn't constant.
Potential energy, and of course on the Earth's surface potential energy is mgh, but out in space potential energy
just let's understand, potential energy is a bullshit term. It doesn't mean anything. It's context energy. So when they say potential energy, it's always a context. You don't have potential energy alone in space. You don't carry it. You don't have any. So when they say potential energy, it only has to do with your relationship to some other thing that can affect the fields around you, the field, the forces that are going to hit you. And that's it. That's all potential is. It's just describing the fact that, oh, you're in a circumstance where the bird is going to shit on your rock and make your rock fall down the hill. Well, yeah, the bird shit had the potential. The rock didn't have any. In a way. Obviously the rock was on the hill. Okay, so, but I'm just saying the thing that instigated the change is also the potential source of the thing that's going to make potential energy mean something. It can't mean something unless you have some idea of how the film is going to roll. If the rock stays there forever, there's no much point in talking about its potential because it was never realized.
As a different equation. The potential energy in space can be written as the gravitational constant times the mass of the object trying to get away from the mass that has a lot of the object.
So this isn't the potential energy. This is just a gravity formula, right? So you're just basically saying your potential energy is based on what else is in the space that you are occupying. There's nothing in the space. There is no potential energy. So it's only, again, a gravity argument. So he's basically saying, what's the gravity in free space? Average. What's the average gravity in free space?
Has a lot of mass divided by the distance between them. So this is what we call the potential energy equation in space. And of course, as you get closer to an object, potential energy decreases. As you go farther away from an object, potential energy increases.
So again, it's just nonsense, right? The only thing that affects you are real forces. So here he's created an R argument, right? When we know that's supposed to be an R squared to be gravity. And the only potential energy there is gravity. So right there you can say that formula can't possibly be right, because he's saying our potential energy is an R factor when we know that gravity is R squared. The actual force that gives us any potential to move, right? The thing that's going to make you move towards another thing is gravity, right? The moon, if we stop the motion, the orbiting, the moon was sitting out there, it would move towards the Earth by an R squared rule, not an R rule. What other force would be affecting it? I just have an Earth and I have a moon, nothing else in the universe. The only force is gravity, and gravity is an R squared. So where do they even get this crap from?
Typically, they put a negative sign in front here because as you get close to an object, it gets to be a lower and lower potential energy. All right, so what happens now when light tries to escape from an object that has a lot of gravity, for example?
So again, there's no potential energy. It's just no such thing. It's just a conceptual word used to describe the fact that we know a force exists and the force acts on it in usually an inverse manner. That's why the R is in the lower part of the equation. And yes, as you get closer to the object, there's less distance to work with. But clearly, the force would be the strongest the closest you get.
A neutron star or a black hole. It works the same for regular stars or galaxies and so forth, but it's much more pronounced in objects that have a tremendous amount of gravitation.
So he's saying that light, if I shine a flashlight off the Earth into space, or a laser beam, that somehow the laser beam is being retarded in its progress by gravity. That gravity is somehow taking away its momentum, stealing its energy. Okay. And it's just it's not a fact. It's not demonstrated by any real evidence that light has that problem. Now, what can be demonstrated, I think, is that light doesn't like traveling through mediums, that it does have an effect. The speed of light in this atmosphere isn't exactly the speed of light in space, okay? It's close, but it isn't the same. So atoms do retard light's progress. As you could logically argue, it's retarding it in lots of different ways. You could say that it's breaking it, in terms of the phase shift. Every time part of the photon goes through something, hits a little tiny atom, that bit of the photon is retarded in its phase. It took a little bit of time to get through the transparent atoms, and that little bit of time taken through each piece ending up randomly hitting something eventually, and they all end up hitting something eventually, over long distances, that would retard the progress of the light to some extent.
Force as it is in a neutron star and a black hole. So any light that tries to get away from a neutron star or a black hole, and remember, you can only get away from a black hole when you're outside the event horizon. Any light that enters into event horizon can simply not escape the black hole and simply will get pulled in.
So again, the consequence of what he's saying here, making this comparison between frequency and momentum or energy, is that he's basically saying that, a radio wave would never be able to leave, and and they could draw a line where visible light couldn't leave, but gamma rays, they could still leave because they somehow have more energy. But by the time they did leave, they wouldn't be a gamma ray anymore. They'd be a visible photon, or they'd be a radio wave, or some other kind of frequency. Because what he's saying is that the frequency is the momentum, and you change the frequency by moving in the gravitational field. And that's not what the evidence demonstrates, if it demonstrates anything. So again, this is just, that somehow photons could physically be captured by gravity. And there's no evidence for that. There's just their speculation, but no evidence.
So only light that's emitted outside the event horizon has a chance of getting away from a black hole. And as it does, the wavelength of that light will actually increase as it pulls away from the black hole. it will still move at the speed of light, but the energy contained within that photon will decrease as it's losing energy, overcoming the gravitational force, the gravitational pull of these objects.
And so vice versa. So he somehow thinks that if I take a regular visible light photon and I shoot it at a black hole, so the light's going into a black hole, that somehow the photon is going to be accelerated, which means it's going to be compressed. So let's say the photon, a visible piece of light, they say 6 to 9 quanta, 6 to 9 bits of photon. So the idea would be visible light, whether you want to think of it as a wave or not, just doesn't matter, would have 9 of these little nodes, wave nodes. All right. And so he's saying that this thing is going to gain this tremendous amount of momentum because I'm going to put it into the gravity of a black hole. And what's going to happen is these nodes are going to get closer together. Okay, so their space is going to contract. So they have this argument that the universe is expanding and that's making all the photons redshifting all of them because it's making more space between them. Like space is expanding right between these little photons. Extra space is being created all the time, and all the photons traveling through space are getting further and further away from each other. The frequencies are getting bigger, and the wavelengths are getting longer and longer and longer, and that's what's causing redshift. Now, this theory is completely different. This one's a complete challenge to that other theory of why there's redshift in the universe, because he's saying the redshift is being created because all the photons trying to leave the suns, they're getting shifted, and that is their frequency is getting, they leave with this frequency and they arrive where we are at some bigger frequency. That's the argument they're making, and it's at odds with their own theory. But anyway, the idea would be is that I take these 9 bits of visible light and I do the super gamma ray compression and I make them into a little tiny gamma ray. Well, the gamma ray still only has 9 little tiny bits of quanta. Still only 9 bits of quanta, and it hits the sun. They say, now that's 1 billion megavolts of energy has just hit the sun because I took a piece of visible light, made its little dots closer to each other. Now I've somehow turned it into something that's 1 billion times more massive and 1 billion times more energy and all of that nonsense. And it's just nonsense. So again, their infinite formula, the fact that they can do anything they want with that F, they can turn it into a zillion, quadrillion, they can go 10 times, 400, whatever. They can create any kind of, speed of light squared. They can just make any preposterously huge number for how close they can get those little bits to each other. And by making them closer, they're arguing that somehow I've now given it supersonic power energy. I've made it really hugely massive. It's an idiotic energy formula. I'm sorry, it's idiotic.
And so the way we can look at it is that the energy, the final energy of a photon, is equal to the initial energy of the photon minus the energy lost to overcome gravity.
So it's just, silly. So it works both ways. So you have to have this huge gamma ray come out of the black hole with this bazillion power strength. And then it gets stretched a little bit and turns into a benign, regular little photon with only 9 little nodes in it. So somehow this thing that had an infinite amount of energy, that really implied that it had an infinite number of little bits in it, right? I mean, that's the only way this infinite energy thing could work. Is they're just playing a dodge. So when they use their little F, and change the frequency, they're also changing how many nodes it has in it. They're making it the same length, okay? Even though it has a higher frequency. It's still a giant piece of 1 second worth. So in 1 second, there would be 1 trillion of these nodes, right? But 1 trillion of those nodes don't come out of the sun. Just a little stupid photon comes out with 9 little nodes in it. So it went from having 1 trillion nodes when it left the sun to only having 9. I mean, that's the implications of their math. It's that unbulletproof.
And so in other words, the final energy of a photon will be equal to the initial energy of the photon, which is the Planck's constant, times the initial frequency that it has, minus...
So I understand when he says the initial frequency, he's also saying our imaginary billion nodes that we gave it. Because when we gave it that very tiny frequency, we increase the number of bits inside of it to what could be calculated to travel across a point in 1 second. And the number that would travel across a 1 point in 1 second would be a trillion. Now, it didn't have a trillion nodes. It didn't have a trillion little humps in its wave. None of that happened. That's not the reality.
The energy loss to overcome gravity, which of course is the potential energy it has to overcome. And the potential energy is equal to, and I'll put the m in front, the small m, which is the mass of the photon. So this would then be the mass of the photon, times g.
And again, he's pointed out that the mass is the frequency. So again, when he says this is the mass of the photon, he's just saying frequency.
Times m divided by r. And you can see then that g is the gravitational constant, m would be the mass of the object we're dealing with, and r would be the distance between the photon and the object. And of course, as the distance gets bigger, the amount of energy that gets lost would get bigger as well. And so if we then put the equivalent...
So again, it doesn't make sense in any real sense, just because obviously we know that gravity has this catch where it's dissipated over a large circumference of a round object, and that's the inverse square law. And it doesn't have a one-to-one relationship. There's no one-to-one relationship. You don't make your own gravity. The photon's not making its own gravity, so you can't use this R number. That's overtly wrong.
M in there, that means that the energy final of the photon will be h times f minus, and that would then be hf over c squared. So that would be the equivalent mass of the photon times g times m over r. And this here is what then would be the final energy of the photon. So as energy is lost...
So, I mean, again, they got the energy of the photon in here twice, right? The frequency, and then they put this fake mass in. So, I mean, they're both the same thing. They've taken this bit, and this bit is in this bit, which doesn't make any sense.
The wavelength then, of course, would get bigger and bigger and bigger because the wavelength is inversely proportional to the energy. We know that the energy of a photon is equal to h times f, which is equal to...
All right, I'd say it again. It's not the energy of the photon. It's nothing implicit in the photon's capacity to create change. The capacity of the photon to create change to where it matters what frequency the photon is. It doesn't have anything to do with its actual momentum, its actual capacity to change anything. What's changing something are the bits, the lumps in that waveform, okay? Without the lumps, that's what's doing something, is the lump, okay? The wave has a lump in it. The lump is the energy, period. There's nothing else. All right, so when I draw them as bits, okay, that's all it has to do with is the frequency it's coming at. And the reason why it matters is because electrons and protons in atoms have a tension between them, okay? The electrons, actually, I don't think they're, in hydrogen atoms, this relationship is linear, frankly. There's proton and electron stuck in the middle. And the point is this thing is in tension. Okay, it's vibrating in tension in a circumstance, and to knock it out of here, to get it to leave its protons, you have to hit it with energy at a frequency. You have to hit it before it can rebound. That is, you have to hit it before it vibrates back to its position. So the frequency has to be higher than the rebound speed of an electron, and then you can release it and get an energetic effect. An effect we call electricity, or an effect that's going to be transmission of the light through the material, or some effect. And that's the limiting factor. And all I have to do is increase this, and I increase the likelihood that I'm going to knock an electron out of its tension. And that's all. That's the only relationship that gives frequency any meaning, that gives it any more energy, except for the obvious relationship. That is, if I was measuring stuff coming across a field at a timed interval, obviously if I fire bullets every half second, I'm going to fire more bullets in a second or in a minute than if I'm firing them one every second. Yes, there's going to be more bullets in the amount of time, but it's clearly not going to be a dramatic increase depending on frequency. And there's a dramatic difference, okay, between infrared light and ultraviolet light in terms of causing this effect. The infrared light hitting it too slow where it has time to vibrate back to its position means you're not going to knock it out of here. And the ultraviolet light will. There's clearly a line that goes like this. All right? Yeah, you can barely see that. I mean, the line on the graph goes like this. Okay? Or more appropriately like this. Okay? Your odds of making a change, it completely changes at one frequency. Now you have a much higher likelihood of kicking the electron, and the likelihood just gets higher and higher as you increase the frequency. Period. And, you know, it's almost, you might as well just draw it like that. That's the relationship. It isn't some linear thing where this is mass 1, you know, is when it's in this condition, and then it's mass 2 when it's a little bit, you know, further apart, and mass 3 and mass 4. No. That's just nonsense. But whatever. So this whole video, I mean, it's not his job to, he's not proving their fantasy theory, he's just explaining it. But I'm saying even in the explanation you can see the bullshit. So he's basically saying that redshift is being caused when light leaves a gravitational object like a sun. And their other theory is that the universe is expanding, and the expanding universe is putting the extra distance between, is increasing the wavelength of all the photons in space. They're constantly being put further and further apart by a bunch of extra space that's going in between them. The waves are getting bigger because a bunch of empty space is being pumped in. That's what yeah, that is their theory, okay? Yeah, it's just sounds silly to me. I guess not to you, but yeah, to me that sounds pretty silly.
hc over lambda. So as this gets smaller, the wavelength gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as light pulls away from these objects, there will be what we call a gravitational redshift, because as the wavelengths get longer, the wave will then get closer and closer to the wavelength of red light.
So let's understand, there's no, when they say event horizon, there can't be any consistent event horizon if you're going to give photons variable momentum. Because then some photons will have the ability to go to a further event horizon, a further distance away. They'll still be able to escape because you're giving them more energy. Even though they can't have more energy, they're little clumps moving at the speed of light. The bullets don't go further because I shoot them every half second and then I shoot them every second. The bullets don't get to go further, but by their theory they do. How fast I shoot them means they go further. That's their theory.
Red light, of course, has the longest wavelengths, and blue light has the shortest wavelengths. So photons can actually change energy as they're pulling away from these very massive objects, like not necessarily a massive object, but very dense object, where the gravitational force is extremely large.
So, and again, how would this even work in terms of changing energy? He's basically saying changing frequency. And so again, somehow it has to change frequency. How can it change frequency without changing velocity? I mean, how is it possible that something could be, you know, moving in a direction, and the direction, you know, they have a certain distance between each other. They're moving at a constant speed. How could I possibly change that without changing the speed of them? How can I make them further apart? Okay, totally. The last one and the first one are now going to be further apart. How can I make them further apart without either making him go faster or him go slower? How is it possible to put these four things in this pattern without changing the speed of some portion of that photon? Some portion of that photon has to change its speed for me to make them further or closer together. There's no way of getting around that. I mean, that's just a giant paradox, a giant unexplainable conundrum. You can't do that. So you can't say the speed of light is a constant now, because you're basically saying I can change the speed of pieces of the photon to expand or contract its frequency.
And as photons pull away from these objects, the actual will change frequency, lose energy to try and escape from that gravitational force, overcoming that difference in the potential energy. And that's how we know it does that. It's quite amazing.
That's not how, that's how we know it does that, is because I told you so, and that's it. There's nothing else. And I told you so based on a M put in quotes a game they're playing with something that everybody should know doesn't make sense, but there is no proportionality. There's no direct proportionality between any kind of concept of the photon's energy, okay, and its effect in the universe. That concept is not proportional. There's not, I add a little bit of energy, a little bit of energy. No. Everything below ultraviolet light fails to produce the electric effect. It fails to kick the electrons. It's just a fact. And they're pretending, no, it's a different kind of fact. For each material it will be different, but I'm just saying for certain materials, if you're anything below an ultraviolet photon, you're not going to move. You're not going to budge the electron because it's under too much tension. And you're not going to you're not going to overcome its rebound speed, and you're not going to kick it loose. And that's just a fact. So there's no proportionality. There's no symmetry in the expression of energy. And there should be.
The photons are actually subject to gravitational forces, and they can lose energy by having to overcome the potential energy difference between being close and being far away from you.
Yeah, well, you said it 3 times. It doesn't make it true.
Very massive objects. And that's how we know a little bit more about the photon.
Yeah, so they don't know more about it. They just made up a story about it, and that's it. And it's a story that doesn't fit their own other stories, so it doesn't fit their expanding universe story. It's not consistent with that. And there's certainly no evidence. There's no hard, good, solid evidence that photons are sped up or slowed down, or that they gain more momentum or less momentum, that any of that crap ever happens. Alright, that's all I can say. Bad video. Yeah, can't see the location bar. Just kind of finds invisible. Some new YouTube feature. Probably a broken browser feature. But anyway. Enough of a video. I can see it's starting to not work. So, we'll call it a day. And such. Thanks.